evening and welcome to the Writer's Block. I'm your host, John Ronan, and as you know now, because we're in our 26th year, I interview writers about their craft, what they're working on today, what they've accomplished in the past, what they might be planning for the future. It's a very broad net. It's not only for writers. We've also had on musicians, we've had on actors, sculptors. If you have an idea for someone who's a guest or a possible guest for the Writer's Block, writer or not, please send us that suggestion. We'd be glad to get your ideas. Our address appears at the end of the program. I also want to remind you that this is an original production of Cape Ann TV, which is a result of community access television. It's not a service you get with Dish, so beware of those commercials you see on television. Tonight, I'm very happy to say we do have an author, a gentleman who's returning for the fourth time because he keeps writing such high-quality, necessary histories about Gloucester and Cape Ann and Massachusetts. His name is Chet Brigham, and he's going to be telling us about his newest book, Phoenix of the Seas, a book about the Ernestina Morrissey schooner. I'm going to read a bit about that schooner and a bit of background about Chet. Phoenix of the Seas tells of how the Ernestina Morrissey has repeatedly been written off as doomed. The happy ending is that, thanks to a combination of state and private funding, she is now undergoing complete restoration. This Phoenix ship will rise from the ashes and spread her white wings over the ocean once again. She is, in fact, spreading those wings pretty wide even as we speak. Chet Brigham has written 3 other books of maritime history. On Opposite Tacks, that is Tacks, which came out in 2011, Gloucester's Bargain with the Sea, 2007, and The Stream I Go A-Fishing In, 2003, which combined maritime history and ship lore with music. It was about the musician and composer John Watson. Chester Brigham, welcome again to the Writer's Block.
My pleasure.
I mentioned, and I'm quite serious about this, your histories always seem to have been necessary books about topics I wasn't familiar with, but I should have been, and I think Gloucester and Cape Ann should have been. I'm curious where you get your ideas.
Well, I think with the Ernestina Morrissey, it was a necessity because a few years ago at the Gloucester Schooner Festival, I heard somebody say, "Where's the Ernestina?" I mean, it used to sail here. As a matter of fact, it won the race in, I think, 2002 or 3, the Gloucester race. That set me to start doing some research into it. And when I began, I found that this was a really remarkable ship with a broad history that took it to the Arctic and to the Cape Verde Islands and to around the Pacific, up to the Arctic and the Pacific, with some amazing characters, particularly Captain Bob Bartlett, who was Robert E. Peary's navigator when Peary made his attempts to reach the North Pole, which may or may not have been successful.
So just a remark you heard at the Schooner Festival
set
you on that track.
That set me off. Because I'd heard, things, a lot of fictional things. Somebody said, well, was that a slave ship? Or was that built someplace else? Or did it? And then hearing that the name the F.E.M. Morrissey tossed in. And actually that was the original name of the ship when it was built in Essex in 1893 and launched on February 1st, 1894 as the F.E.M. Morrissey.
It was built someplace else, but right down the road.
Right down the road.
I want to make sure that we show the book. I'm going to ask our camera woman, Julia, to see if we can get a good shot of that, because there is a picture of the Ernestina Morrissey right on the cover of the book. And there, good. Phoenix of the Seas. And there is the Ernestina, full sails set. She was a schooner and in many ways had a career that paralleled the adventure. She's
did
built in Essex, slightly smaller boat, but
that shot, by the way, is originally in 1894 when she first sailed out of Gloucester Harbor.
so this is
The photo, yep.
this is a 121-year-old picture.
Yes.
She looks good there. She looks good.
Yes, she was about 25 years earlier than the Adventure, and a different style, whereas the Adventure is a round bow, and the Morrissey Ernestina has a long clipper bow that was it was dangerous, and that's why it was done away with about around 1900. But really, it was the most classic design of the schooner.
It has a bowsprit too, as the Adventure does not.
A long bowsprit, yeah. Right.
Well, why explain that danger?
Just that to furl the jibs, the men had to get out on the bowsprit with breaking waves, and a lot of them were lost that way. So
that's one of the reasons Adventure doesn't have the bowsprit.
Right. With the Adventure, all the jibs can be handled from the boat itself, from the bow, from the deck.
Your book is organized around the idea of the Phoenix coming back, and you have the book broken down into different four, I believe, incarnations. Can you tell us about its first career from the 1894 date? I think it was launched in 94.
Yes.
Started built in 93, 94.
Right.
And then for 25 years, and then its first lifetime?
Yes. As a matter of fact, it was built during the hard winter of 1893-94 and built in 4 months. And that was the Essex shipbuilders were so proficient that they could do that, right?
It was a hard winter?
Hard winter, yeah.
Could have been worse than ours last year.
Yeah, right, and we know about that.
Yeah.
Yes, first it was a Grand Bank schooner, and in the classic way, it sent the men to a dory out tub trawling in the same way that Howard Blackburn went out, and so many of them were lost that way.
And you refer to it with the same term as a highliner.
It was a highliner because William Morrissey, the first skipper who bought into it, who owned a piece of the boat, he brought back big catches. And then his son took over, Clayton Morrissey, and he brought in big catches too. And he was a fabulous character, and he became the model for the man at the wheel on the boulevard.
Oh, is that right? the physical model, the person who posed.
He was apparently somehow found the time for Leonard Crass to model him. And then 1905, there was a big consolidation of the ship firms, of the fishing firms in Gloucester under the Gorton, and the company that owned the Morrissey sold it to Canadian interests, and for another 10 years it sailed out of Digby, Nova Scotia, also hand lining, and never had a motor in those times, and it didn't have a motor until its next incarnation.
That's the second incarnation. I want to mention at this point that there's a wonderful selection of black and white photographs which illustrate all of the, I'm not going to show all the photographs, but just give you a sample that there are many which illustrate the ship's activities in all of its incarnations. There are examples from its earliest days to Nova Scotia and then later Cape Verde and others. You can see a very, very nice variety of old prints, and the black and white really helps the tone and the feel of history and lore here with these. I think there are about 14 pages of prints, is that right?
Yes, in two groups, actually,
Oh, yeah. So tell us now, I've got these all marked. I want to talk about the second incarnation, and this has to do with the gentleman you mentioned already, the Bartletts.
Right.
The Bartletts, plural.
But,
There's-
right. First, it was Harold Bartlett, and he took it as a coaster, selling goods along the Newfoundland coast, and then he eventually wasn't able to keep up repairs, and he put it up for sale. And his cousin, Bob Bartlett, came along, and Bob Bartlett had been very world famed, along with Peary, at the around the turn of the century when this polar exploration was going on. So his name was very well known, but he was falling on hard times because people were more interested in airplanes and this.
And you mentioned, of course, was he living in Gloucester?
No, not at the time. No, he was in Newfoundland. He was a Newfoundlander, although the second half of his life he was an American. But he was based in New York because he was trying to turn around funding for an Arctic expedition and not having any luck at it. Then he some exploration people got together and said it was a shame that this great old captain, he was in his mid-40s by then, didn't have a ship. So they sent him out looking for one. He came to Gloucester, and actually he talked to Ben Pine about buying the Columbia, the original Columbia. And Bob Bartlett, as soon as he heard it, with the asking price was $25,000. That was far out of his range. So he wound up buying this rundown old schooner. So here was this rundown old Arctic navigator and this rundown old schooner, and they got together. And to Bartlett, it became his little Morrissey, as he pronounced it.
Little Morrissey?
Morrissey is a Newfoundland dialect. But he loved it. He was a bachelor, and he just loved the ship, and took it to the Arctic for the next 20 years. And 18 of those years were under explorations sponsored by the people like the American Museum of Natural History and other institutions and zoos and the National Geographic. And then World War II came along, and he wouldn't give up the Morrissey. It was commissioned, requisitioned as a troop ship, so called. But he took him out of that and was involved in missions in the Arctic, in Greenland, during the war.
And trying to avoid U-boats.
Trying to avoid U-boats and taking evasive action and returning to the U.S. waters by a very restricted course, giving his instructions in advance as to how long to go on this heading and then this heading. So, and they were dodging submarines. Although he said that at one time there was when a young Navy man yelled submarine, and it turned out to be a whale. And Bob Bartlett said he didn't know how many poor whales had been blown out of the water by nervous sailors in World War II.
Yeah.
But that, so it was, that was a great period, and it was also documented very well. Bartlett had the sense to finance his expeditions by book tours between trips to the Arctic, and also films. And these Pathé films were on shot subjects in American theaters throughout the 20s and 30s. So this ship appeared in your local movie house time and again.
I
during that
think you
period.
mentioned at one point that he wanted Fair to come to Gloucester, so he gave a talk so he could pay for his trip. Is that
Right.
Am I thinking of the right?
Yes,
person?
that's true. He gave a talk in Boston, so to pay his way down to Gloucester. That was the time he was looked at the Columbia, and it was tragic. He didn't feel right about the Columbia, and 2 years after that, the Columbia went down with all 26 crew members aboard, which was one of the worst single ship disasters in Gloucester history. But then, after the war, he was ready to go again, but he died just shortly after the war, and that
I'm
was
still fairly young.
he was almost 70 then.
Oh,
At his
okay.
death-
I
at
had him
his
a
death.
decade younger.
Yeah,
Really.
at his death. Yeah, but he sailed from 45 till 65. But
And that's the second
that was the second incarnation. Right.
incarnation.
Yes.
And the third, and at this point, I want to ask you if you would. We were talking about the third incarnation, which is more exotic because it's on the other side of the Atlantic. If you could describe the general third incarnation, and then maybe pick a short passage to read that you think kind of reflects the tone of the book, but also that section, if you would do that.
Right. I'll try.
So, what is in general the third incarnation?
Well, the third incarnation was the ship was after his death. It was fell into incompetent hands. Ex-sailors from the Pacific who'd never handled a wooden boat. They'd just known steel Navy boats, and it burned and was flooded in Long Island port, and then it was carried up to Row 8 in Connecticut, and a Cape Verdean packet ship operator named Enrique Mendes bought it for very little money, and he managed to, with volunteer help, and I guess I understand by a bottle of whiskey now and then, got it in a condition where it was able to sail back to Cape Verde.
So Cape Verde are the islands off western Africa,
Right.
about 700 miles
Yeah, just about
west
300 miles.
of
Yeah.
Dakar. So a long way from its original home.
Well, I'll just read maybe at the beginning of this point when she left New Bedford and was heading to Cape Verde, where it would serve as an inter-island trading ship for the next 30 years, but also making trips to Providence and picking up clothing and other gifts from the Cape Verdean Americans to go back to the homeland, which was very poor condition and drought, and the number of people that died from starvation there year after year was incredible, and especially during the war. But just on August 18th, 1948, the FEMRC, it was still by that name, was towed by the fishing boat Viking from the New Bedford State Pier into open water. The captain hired by Mendes, Jose Joaquin Pereira of New Bedford, gave the order to hoist sail, and, wonder of wonders, what had been a burned-out, swamped, mud-caked schooner drove her prow into Atlantic swells again. It was testimony to the make-do ship repair skills of Enrique Mendez and his miscellaneous volunteer amateurs that they were able to fix her up sufficiently to cross an ocean. The Morrissey was on her way southeast to Cape Verde, 3,314 land miles away, or just under 3,000 nautical miles. Photos of her and her new rig show a large foresail jib and jumbo, a diminished mainsail, and no topsails. She had 70 tons of cargo aboard, including food and 100 bags of used clothing donated for people on the islands. There was one passenger, too, 65-year-old Antonio Gomez, a section hand on the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad. Antonio was on his way back to visit the wife he had not seen for 10 years.
So that it's interesting to me, that section, the third incarnation, because it moves so far away from its home ports, and but the jobs it was doing were just as difficult as anything it had previously been dealing with. The Atlantic and between the Verdean Islands, which are spread out at great distances. I think they cover half the area of the United States. So it's not island hopping in Hawaii. It's real sailing, and then coming back home.
Yeah, and also the ship, and I think that's one reason why Governor Bill Weld eventually named it the State Ship of Massachusetts, was that it served so many people in so many different ways. It had been serving Eskimos in the Arctic, and along with all of its very useful scientific expedition work, and now here it was bringing relief to people on faraway islands, and not just the used clothing, but it performed. It was provided a link between these people in Massachusetts, mainly these Cape Verdean expatriates in southeastern Massachusetts and Rhode Island, who initially began coming over on the whalers, on the whale ships, because the whale ships would stop at Cape Verde, pick up some crewmen, and then some of them settled in New Bedford. And all these years that the ship was operating as a packet ship to Providence was a year of practically no immigration. So it was the years between 1920 and 1965. Immigration had been shut down almost entirely, 3% or something for the entire, all of the Portuguese, and it was still a Portuguese colony at that time. So this ship provided the only link between these people in Massachusetts and their relatives back on the islands.
In case our audience might have missed it, you mentioned an important fact there again. The Ernestina Morrissey is the official state ship of Massachusetts.
It is.
I didn't know till I read Phoenix of the Seas that we had an official state ship.
I didn't know it either.
But it is.
It struck me as I just came across it by surprise, and I thought, yes, in 1994, Governor Bill Weld proclaimed that
on its 100th anniversary.
Yeah.
We're getting close to the time. I want to talk about the last incarnation, and here again, the Ernestina Morrissey is parallel to the Adventure. What's the fourth incarnation for?
Fourth incarnation was she was. A lot of people became interested in the 70s, including Senator Ted Kennedy, and some of the Cape Verdean people were interested in. Some of Bob Bartlett's old sailing buddies were interested in it. The Explorers Club was interested in it. And a group began trying to raise the money to return it to the United States. And the government of Cape Verde, which at that time, 1975, became an independent country, they were agreeable to returning it to the U.S. when the money was raised, and they did a lot of the restoration needed at that time to, although it took them over a five-year period. And it came back in 1982 to New Bedford, and then began sailing as an educational ship, taking school children out and doing some sail training, and it was
passing all that heritage on.
right. And it was doing that when the funding ran out at the beginning of the recession, and for 10 years, a very loyal bunch of partisans kept pushing for donations and pushing the state to put money back into their state ship. And finally, this last year, the outgoing Deval Patrick administration came up with a sizable amount of money, and two big benefactors came through with a lot of money, and it is now up in Maine being for a 3 or 4 year restoration.
So soon we'll be able to have the ship back in Massachusetts,
Back
our
in the
state
Schooner
ship,
Festival.
and visit it and use it as an educational tool for ourselves and our children.
Right, and it's going to be birthed in the Mass Maritime Academy.
I want to show the book again, and where can viewers buy this, Chet?
In local bookstores and Amazon, and it's also available in a electronic version.
Phoenix of the Seas by Chet Brigham. Chet, I want to thank you very much for being on the Writer's Block again. And as always,
pleasure.
it's been a really educational and important historical experience for me. I was a history minor, so I value this book.
Good, thank you.
I want to thank everybody in our television audience as well for being with us on the Writer's Block tonight. If you've learned something about the Massachusetts state ship, the Ernestina Morrissey, and all of the lore included under that name, then the Writer's Block has done its job. Thanks for being with us, and I hope to see you again next week on the Writer's Block. Good night.